Sometimes, the loneliest hearts find each other in the most unexpected places. When you've lost everyone you've ever loved, even the smallest act of kindness can change everything. In Montana Territory, 57-year-old trapper Silas McGraw lived alone with his regrets. One evening by Elkbone Creek, he heard desperate cries from the rushing water. A tiny grizzly cub was drowning. Silas dove in without thinking and pulled the shivering creature to shore. He should have walked away. Instead, he saw something familiar in those frightened eyes, the same loneliness that haunted his own heart. He named the cub Hickory and took him home. What followed was an unlikely friendship between two lost souls who needed each other more than they knew. But what happens when winter comes and Hickory must choose between the wild and the old man? Who saved his life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin stood like a weathered sentinel against the Montana skyline, its log walls darkened by decades of mountain storms and summer sun. Silas McGraw had built it with his own hands 32 years ago, when his back was straighter and his heart carried different burdens. Now, as autumn painted the aspens gold and the first frost kissed the meadow grass, he sat on his porch watching smoke curl from his chimney into the crisp morning air. At 57, Silas wore his solitude like a familiar coat, comfortable in its weight, yet somehow always aware of its presence. His weathered hands, scarred from countless encounters with trap springs and mountain thorns, cradled a steaming cup of coffee as he surveyed the valley below. Elkbone Creek meandered through the bottom land like a silver ribbon, the same creek that had brought an unexpected visitor into his world just 3 weeks prior. The grizzly cub, Hickory, as Silas had taken to calling him, was currently engaged in a fierce battle with a pine cone near the cabin's foundation. The little bear, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, had grown considerably since that evening when Silas had pulled him from the rushing water. His dark brown fur had filled out, and the ribs that had once shown prominently beneath wet, matted hair were now hidden beneath a healthy layer of fat that would serve him well in the coming winter. Silas took another sip of his coffee and allowed himself a rare smile as he watched Hickory's antics. The cub had developed a peculiar habit of talking to himself, a series of huffs, grunts, and small roars that seemed to provide commentary on whatever task occupied his attention. This morning's monologue appeared to focus on the strategic complexities of pine cone demolition. "You got strong opinions about everything, don't you, little fella?" Silas murmured, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who spent more time talking to the mountains than to other people. The sound of his voice caused Hickory to abandon his pine cone and lumber over to the porch steps. The cub had learned that Silas's morning coffee ritual often coincided with breakfast, and Hickory had developed an impressive appetite. Silas reached into a wooden crate beside his chair and extracted a handful of dried berries, mixed with chunks of fish jerky, a concoction he devised after realizing that regular bear food was in short supply at the nearest trading post, which happened to be 47 miles down the mountain. As Hickory munched contentedly on his breakfast, Silas's mind wandered to the life he'd lived before this unlikely companionship. He'd been born in these mountains, the son of a trapper who taught him to read the wilderness like other men read newspapers. His father, Elkbone McGraw, had been a man of few words but profound understanding of the natural world. From him, Silas had learned not just how to set traps and track game, but how to listen to the subtle conversations the mountains held with those patient enough to hear them. The old cabin held memories in every board and beam. This was where he brought his bride, Mary Catherine, 41 years ago. She'd been a town girl from Helena, drawn to his quiet strength and the promise of a life lived close to the earth. For 15 years, she'd made this isolated place feel like the center of the universe. Her laughter had echoed off these walls, her humming had provided soundtrack to countless evenings, and her gentle presence had transformed a bachelor's rough shelter into a home. The fever had taken her during the particularly harsh winter of 1878. Silas had ridden through 3 days of blizzard to reach the doctor in Copper Falls. But by the time they'd returned, Mary Catherine was already beyond help. She died in the bed they'd shared, holding his hand and making him promise to keep living, to find reasons to smile again. For a while, he'd tried to honor that promise. He'd continued his trapping, had even made efforts to socialize when he came to town for supplies. But grief has its own timeline, and Silas found that his heart had developed a preference for solitude. The mountains didn't judge his silences or expect him to be something he no longer felt capable of being. Their son, Thomas, had been born 2 years into their marriage, but had lived only 6 days. The tiny grave behind the cabin was marked with a cross Silas had carved from mountain ash, and every spring he planted wildflowers there, maintaining a small ritual that kept memory alive without drowning him in sorrow. Over the years, a few other souls had wandered into Silas's world. There had been his younger brother, Samuel, who'd visited regularly until consumption claimed him 5 years back. Old Pete Jarrison, a fellow trapper who'd occasionally shared meals and stories, had frozen to death in his cabin 3 winters ago. Even Father McKinnon, the traveling priest who'd blessed Mary Catherine's grave and had made it his habit to check on Silas twice a year, had been thrown from his horse and killed on the trail to Missoula last spring. Death, it seemed, had a particular fondness for anyone who got too close to Silas McGraw. He'd begun to think of himself as cursed, a man whose love carried a fatal price for those who accepted it. Better to live alone, he'd reasoned, than to lose anyone else to whatever dark fortune seemed to follow in his wake. But now there was Hickory, and Silas found himself caught between the familiar comfort of emotional distance and the unexpected warmth of caring for another living creature. The cub had no knowledge of Silas's history with loss, no awareness that affection in this cabin had historically carried mortal consequences. Hickory simply existed in each moment, finding joy in pine cones and berries, comfort in Silas's presence, and security in the routine they'd established together. The morning routine had developed naturally over their 3 weeks together. Silas would wake before dawn, as was his long-standing habit, and step onto the porch to gauge the weather and listen to the mountain's morning news, which birds were active, how the wind was moving, whether any large game had passed near the cabin. During the night, Hickory would emerge from wherever he'd chosen to sleep. The location varied, though he seemed to prefer a spot near the fireplace on cooler nights, and would begin his own survey of the immediate area. After breakfast, Silas would attend to the daily tasks that kept his isolated homestead functioning. There were always traps to check, repairs to make, firewood to split, and food to preserve for the approaching winter. Hickory had appointed himself as assistant and supervisor for these activities, a role he took seriously despite his frequent tendency to create more work than he helped accomplish. The cub had proven particularly talented at reorganizing Silas's carefully arranged woodpile, investigating the contents of every container or bag within reach, and providing detailed commentary on the quality of Silas's craftsmanship. He'd also developed a fascination with Silas's leatherwork, often absconding with strips of hide that would later be discovered in various states of artistic rearrangement around the cabin grounds. Despite these minor disruptions to his orderly existence, Silas found himself looking forward to Hickory's involvement in his daily tasks. The cub's curiosity was infectious, causing Silas to notice details in his familiar world that he'd overlooked for years. Hickory's enthusiastic investigation of a spider's web had led Silas to spend nearly an hour observing the intricate architecture, marveling at engineering skills that put his own rough carpentry to shame. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Silas would typically take a walk to check his trap line, a circuit that covered roughly 5 miles of mountain terrain. Initially, he'd left Hickory at the cabin, concerned that the cub might interfere with his work or get into trouble in the wilderness. But Hickory had responded to being left behind with such obvious distress pacing, whimpering and attempting to dig through the cabin door, that Silas had relented and begun bringing him along. The cub had proven to be an excellent hiking companion. His natural instincts kept him alert to potential dangers, and his presence actually seemed to make other wildlife more cautious about approaching Silas's trap sites. Hickory had quickly learned the boundaries of safe behavior around the steel traps, and he developed his own inspection routine, sniffing each location thoroughly before moving on to the next. These afternoon expeditions had become Silas's favorite part of each day. Walking the familiar trails with Hickory padding along beside him, he found himself talking more than he had in years. The cub proved to be an excellent listener, responding to Silas's observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and mountain folklore with appropriate grunts and huffs that somehow felt like genuine conversation. "See how the elk have been moving through here?" Silas would point out tracks in the soft earth near a stream crossing. "They're heading down toward Winter Range earlier than usual. Means we're in for a hard season." Hickory would examine the tracks with serious attention, sometimes adding his own paw print alongside the elk sign, as if registering his agreement with Silas's assessment. These conversations filled a void in Silas's life that he hadn't fully recognized until it began to close. He'd always been a man who thought out loud, but years of solitude had gradually silenced that habit. With Hickory as his audience, he rediscovered the pleasure of sharing his observations, of putting his knowledge and experience into words that helped clarify his own understanding of the world around them. The evenings had developed their own rhythm as well. After supper, usually a simple meal of whatever game Silas had caught, supplemented with vegetables from his small garden, they would sit together on the porch if the weather was pleasant, or near the fireplace if the night carried a chill. Silas would work on whatever project demanded attention, mending a harness, sharpening tools, or crafting items for trade in town, while Hickory would curl up nearby, occasionally offering advice in the form of sleepy mumbles. Sometimes, Silas would find himself talking about Mary Catherine during these quiet hours. He'd tell Hickory about her love of wildflowers, her talent for making even the simplest meal feel like a celebration, her way of humming while she worked that had made the cabin feel alive with music. These weren't conversations he'd had with anyone since her death, and speaking her name aloud again felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed for too long. "She would have loved you, little fella," he told Hickory one evening as they watched the sun set behind the western peaks. Always had a soft spot for creatures that needed looking after. As autumn deepened into late October, Silas began to notice changes in Hickory that stirred both pride and concern. The cub was growing rapidly, his shoulders broadening and his strength increasing noticeably from week to week. His play had become more vigorous, his mock battles with logs and rocks displaying the power that would one day make him a formidable predator. His appetite had grown accordingly, and Silas found himself spending more time hunting and fishing to keep pace with Hickory's expanding dietary requirements. But more troubling were the moments when Hickory would stop in the middle of play or exploration, his head lifted, and his attention focused on something beyond Silas's perception. During these episodes, the cub would remain motionless for several minutes, his dark eyes fixed on the distant mountains, his body tense with an alertness that spoke of instincts older and deeper than their domestic routine. These moments reminded Silas of the fundamental truth he'd been trying to ignore. Hickory was not a pet, not truly domesticated, but a wild creature whose true home lay in the vast wilderness that surrounded their small clearing. The approaching winter would bring challenges that would test both the cub's survival skills and the strength of the bond they'd formed. The first snow was still weeks away, but Silas could read the signs in the changing light, the behavior of migrating birds, and the way the wind carried different scents down from the high country. Soon, Hickory would face the same choice that confronted all wild things in this harsh land: adapt to the demands of winter, or perish. The question that kept Silas awake during the increasingly long nights was whether love, even the deep, unexpected love he'd come to feel for this unlikely companion, was enough to guide them both safely through the trials that lay ahead. Asterisk. The scream that shattered the pre-dawn silence was unlike anything Silas had heard in his 30-plus years in these mountains. It was high, keening, and filled with a desperation that pulled him from sleep like a physical blow. He sat up in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, every instinct honed by decades of wilderness living suddenly alert. The sound came again, closer this time, and unmistakably the cry of a bear in distress. Silas threw off his blankets and reached for the rifle that always stood within arm's reach of his bed. His bare feet hit the cold floor as he moved to the window, peering through the dim gray light of early morning toward the source of the commotion. What he saw made his blood run cold. A massive grizzly sow, easily 600 pounds and standing nearly 8 feet tall on her hind legs, was circling his cabin with the desperate, aggressive movements of an animal driven beyond reason by grief and rage. Her golden-brown fur was matted with brambles and mud, and even from a distance, Silas could see the wild light of madness in her small, dark eyes. She was calling for her cub. Hickory, who had been sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, was now pressed against the cabin's back wall, his own instincts telling him that the voice outside belonged to family and that he was somehow the cause of the terror in that voice. The young bear whimpered softly, a sound that seemed to trigger an even more violent response from the sow outside. Silas understood the situation with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of reading the wilderness. This was Hickory's mother, and she had spent the past 3 weeks searching for her lost cub. The torrential rains that had followed the night of the rescue had washed away scent trails, making tracking impossible. But now, with the weather clear and the wind favorable, she had finally caught his scent, and she wanted him back. The sow's massive paws left deep gouges in the earth as she continued her frantic circling, pausing occasionally to rear up and test the air with her sensitive nose. Each time she confirmed that her cub was inside the human dwelling, her rage seemed to intensify. She began scratching at the cabin walls, her claws each as long as a man's finger tearing chunks from the seasoned logs. Silas had dealt with aggressive bears before, but never under circumstances like these. Usually, bears could be discouraged with loud noises or warning shots. They were naturally cautious around humans and would typically withdraw when confronted with determined resistance. But a mother searching for her young operated under different rules entirely. Maternal instinct overrode caution, fear, and even self-preservation. Inside the cabin, Hickory's whimpering had grown louder, and he was now pacing back and forth near the door, clearly torn between his attachment to Silas and the primal call of his mother's voice. The cub's distress was palpable, and Silas felt his heart breaking as he watched the small bear struggle with forces he couldn't understand. The sow's investigation of the cabin was becoming more destructive by the minute. She had discovered the door and was now throwing her considerable weight against it, testing its strength. The heavy wooden barrier, reinforced with iron strapping, held firm, but Silas could hear the frame beginning to creak under the assault. He moved quietly to his gun cabinet and selected his most powerful rifle, a .45 to 70 government that could drop an elk at 200 yards. But even as his hands went through the familiar motions of loading the weapon, his mind rebelled against the necessity he was facing. Killing this bear would solve his immediate problem, but it would also destroy something precious and irreplaceable. The sow was simply being what nature had made her, a mother, protecting her young. More troubling still was the question of what killing Hickory's mother would do to the cub. Even at his young age, Hickory would understand what had happened. The smell of his mother's blood, the absence of her voice, the terrible stillness that followed violence, all of this would imprint itself on the young bear's consciousness. Could Silas live with the knowledge that he had orphaned Hickory a second time, and by his own hand? The assault on the door intensified, and Silas heard one of the hinges begin to give way. He had perhaps minutes before the sow broke through. And then there would be no avoiding a confrontation. In the confined space of the cabin, with Hickory caught between them, someone was going to die. Silas looked at the young bear, who was now pressed against the door, responding to his mother's calls with increasingly urgent cries of his own. The cub's torn loyalties were written in every line of his small body. The pull toward the familiar human who had fed and sheltered him, warring against the deeper call of blood and species. The decision that had been building in Silas's mind for weeks suddenly crystallized with painful clarity. Hickory belonged with his mother, in the world that had shaped him long before Silas had pulled him from Elkbone Creek. The 3 weeks they'd shared had been a gift, an unexpected blessing that had reminded Silas what it felt like to care for another living thing. But gifts sometimes came with the obligation to let them go. Moving slowly and deliberately, Silas set down his rifle and walked to where Hickory was pawing at the door. The cub looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond his months of life, as if he understood the choice that was being offered. "I know, little fella," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I know she's calling you home." Outside, the sow's assault on the door had paused, and Silas could hear her moving around the cabin's perimeter, perhaps searching for another point of entry. The temporary quiet gave him a moment to think, to plan what might be the most important action of his life. He couldn't simply open the door and hope for the best. The sow was in a state of aggressive panic, and her first instinct upon seeing a human near her cub would be to attack. Silas needed to give mother and child a chance to reunite without him becoming part of the equation. Moving to his supply cabinet, Silas withdrew a piece of rope and fashioned a simple loop. It wasn't ideal, but it would allow him to open the door from a distance, giving Hickory the freedom to choose his own path while keeping Silas out of immediate danger. As he worked, his mind filled with memories of the past 3 weeks. Hickory's first tentative steps around the cabin, the way the cub had learned to recognize the sound of Silas's morning coffee routine, the companionable silence of their evening hours together. Each memory felt like a small death, a loss that would leave its mark on his heart for whatever years remained to him. But along with the grief came something unexpected, a sense of rightness, of completing a circle that had begun on that dusky evening by Elkbone Creek. He had pulled Hickory from the water not to possess him, but to save him. Now, saving him meant letting him go. The sow's roar brought Silas back to the immediate crisis. She had returned to the door and was renewing her assault with even greater fury. The sound of splintering wood told him that his time had run out. Hickory was now crying constantly, a sound that tore at Silas's heart, even as it provided the final confirmation of what needed to happen. The cub was calling to his mother, ready to return to the world that had made him. Silas attached his rope to the door latch and backed toward the cabin's rear wall, playing out the line as he moved. Hickory watched these preparations with intelligent eyes, seeming to understand that change was coming. "You've been a good friend, Hickory," Silas said softly, his voice barely audible over the sow's continued assault on the door. "The best friend an old fool like me had any right to expect." The cub padded over to him and pressed his warm, furry body against Silas's legs, a gesture of affection that nearly undid the older man's resolve. For a moment, Silas wavered, wondering if there might be some other solution, some way to preserve the bond they'd formed without condemning one of them to death. But then the door frame gave a mighty crack, and reality reasserted itself. There was no middle ground here, no compromise that would satisfy both the demands of the heart and the harsh requirements of survival. This was the wilderness, where love sometimes meant having the courage to let go. Silas took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever powers governed the fate of lonely men and lost creatures, and pulled the rope. The door swung open, and chaos erupted. The sow charged through the opening like a force of nature, her massive bulk filling the doorway, and her roar shaking the cabin's walls. For a heart-stopping moment, her wild eyes locked onto Silas, and he saw his death reflected in their depths. But then Hickory stepped between them, his small voice raised in the complex vocalizations that bears use to communicate with their own kind. The effect on the sow was immediate and dramatic. Her charge stopped as if she had hit an invisible wall, and her roar faded to a series of worried grunts and huffs. Mother and cub approached each other with the careful deliberation of family members separated by trauma and uncertainty. The sow lowered her massive head to sniff her offspring, confirming his identity and health with the thoroughness that only a mother's love could provide. Hickory submitted to this examination with patience, occasionally responding with soft sounds that seemed to reassure and comfort the larger bear. Silas watched this reunion from his position against the back wall, hardly daring to breathe. The sow was still aware of his presence. Her ears tracked his every movement, and he could see the tension in her powerful shoulders. But her focus was entirely on her recovered cub, and for the moment, at least, Silas was a secondary concern. Examination complete. The sow gently nudged Hickory toward the open door. The cub obeyed, but not without a backward glance at Silas that conveyed more gratitude and affection than any words could have expressed. Then, with his mother's massive form sheltering him, Hickory walked out of the cabin and back into the wilderness that had always been his true home. Silas remained motionless until the sounds of their departure had faded into the distance. Only then did he allow himself to sink to the floor, his legs suddenly unable to support the weight of what he had just experienced. The cabin felt impossibly empty, hollow in a way that had nothing to do with its physical dimensions. For the first time in over 20 years, Silas McGraw wept not just for the loss of Hickory, but for Mary Catherine, for his brother Samuel, for old Pete Garrison, and for all the connections that life had given him only to take away. He wept for the loneliness that seemed to be his constant companion, and for the cruel joke of a heart that continued to love despite the pain that love inevitably brought. But as his tears finally subsided, and the mountain silence settled back around his cabin, Silas became aware of something else, a sense of completion, of having done the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. He had loved Hickory enough to let him go, and in doing so, he had perhaps learned something about the nature of love itself. The door hung open, its frame damaged but still functional. Cold morning air flowed through the opening, carrying with it the sense of autumn and the promise of approaching winter. Somewhere in the distance, carried on that same wind, came the sound of two bears moving through the forest, a mother and her recovered cub, heading toward whatever future the wilderness held for them. Silas rose slowly, his joints protesting the sudden movement, and walked to the open door. The tracks in the soft earth told the story clearly, the sow's massive paw prints overlapping the smaller marks left by Hickory, both sets leading toward the high country where the big bears would spend the winter months. As he stood there, breathing the crisp mountain air and listening to the gradually lightening forest, Silas McGraw understood that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The past 3 weeks had reminded him what it felt like to care for another living thing, to have his daily routine shaped by someone else's needs, to find joy in simple moments of companionship. Now that gift had been taken away, but the memory of it remained. And perhaps, Silas thought as he began the task of repairing his damaged door, That memory would be enough to carry him through whatever trials lay ahead. Asterisk, the silence that followed. Hickory's departure was unlike any quiet Silas had ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable solitude he'd known for decades, nor even the hollow emptiness that had filled his days after Mary Catherine's death. This was something different, a silence that seemed to echo with absent voices, that made every familiar sound in his cabin feel strange and displaced. 3 days had passed since the reunion, and Silas found himself moving through his daily routines like a man walking through a dream. He still rose before dawn, still made his coffee on the old wood stove, still stepped onto the porch to read the mountain's morning news. But everything felt different now, colored by an absence that seemed to grow larger rather than smaller. With each passing hour, the wooden crate beside his chair, where he'd kept Hickory's supply of berries and fish jerky, sat empty, but still within easy reach. Silas hadn't been able to bring himself to put it away, just as he'd left a small pile of blankets near the fireplace where the cub had liked to sleep. These remnants of their shared life served as both comfort and torment, reminders of a happiness that had been as brief as it was unexpected. On the morning of the 4th day, Silas made a decision that surprised him. Instead of checking his trapline as usual, he found himself walking toward Elkbone Creek, the place where this whole unlikely chapter of his life had begun. He told himself he was simply varying his routine, exploring a section of his property that he'd somewhat neglected over the past weeks. But deep down, he knew he was hoping for some sign of Hickory and his mother, some indication of how they were faring in their reunion. The creek ran clear and cold, its familiar murmur providing a counterpoint to his footsteps on the rocky bank. Autumn had progressed significantly since that evening when he'd first heard a drowning cub's cries. The aspens were now bare, their golden leaves carpeting the forest floor in a brilliant tapestry that rustled softly in the morning breeze. Soon, the first snow would arrive, and the easy traveling of autumn would give way to winter's challenges. As he walked, Silas found himself remembering not just the rescue itself, but the moments that had led up to it. He'd been coming back from checking his northernmost trap when he'd heard those desperate cries. His first instinct had been to investigate, not out of any heroic impulse, but simply because unexplained sounds in the wilderness often meant trouble, and trouble in these mountains had a way of spreading if not addressed. He'd expected to find an injured deer, perhaps, or a young elk caught in deadfall. The sight of a tiny grizzly cub struggling against the current had stopped him in his tracks. For a moment, he'd simply watched, knowing that intervention might save one life while potentially ending his own. Mother bears were notoriously protective, and the sow could have been anywhere nearby. But something about the cub's struggle had spoken to a part of Silas that he'd thought was permanently buried with Mary Catherine. The desperate fight against forces too large to overcome, the refusal to surrender, even when defeat seemed certain. These were qualities he recognized, qualities that resonated with his own long battle against loneliness and despair. Now, standing at the same spot where he'd made that fateful decision, Silas wondered if he would make the same choice again. The pain of losing Hickory was sharp and immediate, cutting through the protective numbness he'd cultivated over the years. It reminded him why he'd chosen solitude in the first place, why loving anything in this harsh world was an invitation to heartbreak. But even as these thoughts filled his mind, Silas found himself searching the ground for signs of recent bear activity. The soft earth near the water's edge held tracks from various animals, deer, elk, a few smaller creatures, but nothing that suggested a mother bear and her cub had passed this way recently. He followed the creek downstream for nearly a mile, his eyes automatically reading the signs left by the forest's inhabitants. Old habits died hard, and tracking had been so much a part of his life for so long that he barely noticed himself cataloging the stories written in mud and sand. A family of raccoons had visited the creek 2 nights ago. A large buck had come down to drink just after sunrise. A fox had been fishing in the shallows, probably hoping to catch one of the late-season trout that still lingered in the deeper pools, but no bears. No sign that Hickory and his mother had chosen this familiar territory for their reunion activities. As the morning wore on, Silas gradually worked his way back toward his cabin, following game trails that crisscrossed the mountainside like an ancient road system. These paths had been carved by generations of wildlife, each species adding its own modifications over the decades. Elk had established the major routes, following the natural contours of the land. Deer had created the shortcuts and secondary branches. Smaller animals had added their own tiny tributaries to this network, creating a transportation system that was both practical and beautiful in its organic efficiency. Halfway home, Silas paused at a rocky outcropping that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. This was one of his favorite spots, a place where he'd often come to think through problems or simply enjoy the majesty of his mountain home. Today, the vista spread before him like a living map, showing him the interconnected web of meadows, forests, and waterways that made up his world. From this vantage point, he could see his cabin nestled in its clearing, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray line. The sight should have been comforting, a symbol of home and security in the vast wilderness. Instead, it looked small and isolated, a tiny human intrusion in the landscape that existed quite happily without human presence. For the first time since Mary Catherine's death, Silas found himself questioning the choices that had led him to this point. Had his self-imposed exile really been about protecting others from the curse that seemed to follow him? Or had it been about protecting himself from the vulnerability that came with caring? Had his solitude been noble sacrifice or elaborate cowardice? The questions were uncomfortable, and Silas didn't have answers for them. But the very fact that he was asking them suggested that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. Hickory's brief presence had cracked open something in his heart that had been sealed for decades. And now he was struggling to deal with what was leaking out. As he sat on the warm rocks, letting the sun chase away the morning chill, Silas became aware of movement in the forest below. At first, he thought it might be elk. The motion was large enough and deliberate enough to suggest a sizable animal. But as he watched more carefully, he realized he was observing something far more interesting. A black bear, smaller than Hickory's mother, but still fully adult, was making its way along one of the deer trails that ran parallel to Elkbone Creek. The bear moved with the unhurried confidence of an animal in familiar territory, occasionally pausing to investigate something that caught its interest. This was normal behavior for autumn, when bears were busy building up fat reserves for the coming winter, hibernation. But what made the sighting unusual was the bear's destination. As Silas watched, the animal left the deer trail and began climbing toward the rocky outcropping where he was sitting. This particular route didn't lead anywhere that a bear would normally want to go. No berry patches, no water sources, no obvious food possibilities. Yet the bear continued its ascent, moving with what seemed like deliberate purpose. Silas remained perfectly still, knowing that movement would likely cause the bear to change course. Black bears were generally less aggressive than grizzlies, but they were still wild animals deserving of respect and caution. This one appeared to be young, probably only a few years old, but even a young black bear was capable of doing serious damage to an unprepared human. As the bear drew closer, Silas began to notice details that made him increasingly puzzled. The animal's coat was a deep, rich black with no brown markings, unusual but not unheard of. More interesting was the bear's behavior. Instead of the focused foraging typical of autumn bears, this one seemed almost casual in its movements, as if it was exploring rather than hunting for food. When the bear was perhaps 50 yards away, it stopped and looked directly at Silas with intelligent, curious eyes. For a long moment, man and animal regarded each other across the rocky slope. There was no aggression in the bear's posture, no sign of the wariness that wild animals typically displayed around humans. Instead, there seemed to be a kind of recognition, as if the bear was confirming something it had suspected. Then, to Silas's amazement, the bear sat down on its haunches and continued watching him with what could only be described as thoughtful attention. This was behavior he'd never observed in any wild bear, and it left him feeling distinctly unsettled. Bears were not naturally curious about humans. They typically either fled or demonstrated aggression when they encountered people. This calm, contemplative observation was something entirely outside his experience. For nearly 10 minutes, they maintained their mutual study. Silas found himself wondering if this might be another orphaned bear, perhaps one that had encountered humans before and learned to associate them with food or safety. But the animal showed none of the begging behavior typical of bears that had been fed by people. Instead, it seemed simply interested, as if Silas represented some kind of puzzle to be solved. Finally, the bear rose to its feet and continued its climb past Silas's position. As it passed, no more than 20 yards away, it paused again and seemed to nod in his direction, a gesture so human-like that Silas wondered if he was imagining things. Then it disappeared over the ridge, leaving him alone with more questions than answers. The encounter left Silas deeply thoughtful as he made his way back to the cabin. In all his years in these mountains, he'd never experienced anything quite like that peaceful, almost companionable meeting with a wild bear. It was as if the animal had sought him out specifically, had wanted to take his measure for reasons Silas couldn't begin to understand. Back at the cabin, he went through the motions of his afternoon routine, checking and maintaining his equipment, preparing a simple meal, splitting firewood for the evening fire. But his mind kept returning to the black bear and its strange behavior. There had been something almost familiar about the animal, though Silas was certain he'd never seen it before dawn. As evening approached and he settled into his chair by the fireplace, Silas found himself wondering if the encounter had been as significant as it had felt, or if his grief over losing Hickory was making him read meaning into random events. The wilderness was full of mysteries, and not all of them had explanations that made sense to human understanding. But one thing was certain. The afternoon had reminded him that his world was larger and more complex than the small circle of his daily routines. There were other stories being written in these mountains, other lives being lived according to patterns and purposes he could only guess at. And perhaps, if he was willing to pay attention, those stories might have something to teach him about his own. Asterisk. The black bear returned 3 days later. Silas was splitting firewood behind his cabin when he caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. He paused, axe suspended mid-swing, and watched as the same bear he'd encountered at the rocky outcropping emerged from the tree line with that same unhurried, deliberate gait. There was no mistaking the animal, the glossy black coat, the intelligent eyes, the unusually calm demeanor that had marked their first meeting. This time, however, the bear's behavior was even more puzzling. Instead of maintaining the respectful distance that wild animals typically observed around human habitations, it approached to within 30 yards of the cabin and then simply sat down, as if settling in to watch Silas work. Silas lowered his axe slowly, his mind racing through the possible explanations for this unprecedented behavior. Bears didn't seek out human company. They certainly didn't sit and observe human activities with the patient attention of an interested spectator. Every instinct told him that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture, yet the bear showed no signs of aggression, illness, or the disorientation that might accompany rabies. For several minutes, man and bear regarded each other across the clearing. The bear's posture was relaxed, almost companionable, as if it had come calling on a neighbor and was waiting for an invitation to approach closer. Its dark eyes tracked Silas's every movement with an intelligence that seemed to go, beyond typical animal awareness. Finally, moving very slowly so as not to startle his unusual visitor, Silas set down his axe and took a step toward the cabin. The bear's ears pricked forward with interest, but it made no move to either advance or retreat. Encouraged by this lack of reaction, Silas continued his careful progress toward the door, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Once inside, he moved to the window that offered the best view of the clearing. The bear was still there, still sitting in the same patient posture, its attention focused on the spot where Silas had been working. It was as if the animal was waiting for him to return and resume his activities. Silas found himself thinking of Hickory, of the way the young cub had appointed himself supervisor of all cabin activities. There had been something almost ritualistic about Hickory's involvement in the daily routines, a sense that he was not just observing, but participating in some essential way. Could this adult bear be exhibiting similar behavior? And if so, what did that suggest about the complex social intelligence of these creatures? After watching for another 10 minutes, Silas made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He opened the cabin door and stepped back onto the porch, carrying with him a piece of dried fish from his winter stores. The bear's attention immediately focused on him, and Silas could see its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the food. But instead of approaching with the eager hunger he might have expected, the bear remained seated, watching him with that same thoughtful expression. It was as if the animal understood that accepting food would change the nature of their relationship, and it was considering whether such a change was desirable. Silas tossed the piece of fish halfway between himself and the bear, then retreated to his porch to observe what would happen next. The bear looked at the offering, then back at Silas, then at the fish again. Its internal debate was almost visible, and Silas found himself holding his breath as he waited for the animal's decision. Finally, the bear rose to its feet and moved toward the fish with slow, deliberate steps. It sniffed the offering carefully before picking it up and consuming it with obvious appreciation. Then, instead of begging for more or approaching closer, the bear returned to its original position and resumed its patient observation. This behavior was so unlike anything in Silas's experience with wild animals that he wondered if he was witnessing something unprecedented, or if his isolation had finally driven him to the edge of madness. Bears were supposed to be either afraid of humans or aggressively territorial around them. They weren't supposed to behave like thoughtful visitors seeking quiet companionship. Over the next hour, the bear maintained its vigil while Silas cautiously resumed his work. Every few minutes, he would glance toward his unusual audience, half expecting to find that the animal had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. But the bear remained constant in its attention, occasionally shifting position for comfort, but never showing any inclination to leave Dot as the afternoon wore on. Silas found himself talking quietly to the bear, much as he had talked to Hickory. During their time together, he commented on the weather, described his plans for winter preparations, and even shared some of his thoughts about the strange turn his life had taken over the past month. The bear listened with apparent interest, occasionally tilting its head or adjusting its posture in ways that seemed almost conversational. "You're not like the others, are you?" Silas said as he stacked the split wood. "Something about you reminds me of another friend I had. Little fellow named Hickory. Don't suppose you know him?" At the mention of Hickory's name, the bear's reaction was immediate and startling. It rose to its feet and took several steps closer, its entire body language shifting from casual observation to intense focus. The change was so dramatic that Silas stopped working entirely, his attention now completely captured by his visitor's behavior. The bear began making soft vocalizations, not the huffs and grunts typical of its species, but sounds that seemed almost like attempts at communication. It paced back and forth for a few moments, then sat down again, this time much closer to Silas's position. The dark eyes that had been merely curious before now held an urgency that was unmistakable. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. There was something in the bear's behavior that suggested a connection. He couldn't quite grasp a familiarity that went beyond their recent encounters. The animal's reaction to Hickory's name had been too immediate, too specific to be coincidental. "You do know him, don't you?" Silas said softly, setting down his tools and focusing entirely on the bear. "You've seen Hickory and his mother." Again, the bear's response was unmistakable. It rose and moved closer still, stopping just at the edge of what Silas considered safe distance. From this position, its attempts at communication became more complex, a series of sounds and gestures that seemed designed to convey specific information. Suddenly, the bear turned and began walking toward the tree line, but not in the manner of an animal departing. Instead, it moved a few steps, then stopped and looked back at Silas, clearly waiting for him to follow. When Silas didn't immediately respond, the bear repeated the behavior, this time adding what could only be described as an encouraging vocalization. The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. This bear wasn't just a random visitor seeking companionship or food. It was here with a purpose, carrying information about Hickory that it was desperately trying to communicate. And it wanted Silas to come with it. For a moment, Silas hesitated. Following a wild bear into the forest was exactly the kind of decision that ended badly for humans in these mountains. Bears were unpredictable, and their motivations were often impossible for humans to understand. Even if this particular animal seemed friendly, there was no guarantee that its intentions were benign. But as he watched the bear's increasingly urgent attempts to get his attention, Silas found himself thinking about the patterns of behavior he'd observed over their brief acquaintance. This animal had approached him twice now, both times displaying intelligence and restraint that suggested capabilities beyond normal bear cognition. Its reaction to Hickory's name had been immediate and specific, and its current behavior strongly suggested that it had news about the young cub news, that it considered important enough to risk approaching a human settlement. The bear made one more attempt to encourage Silas to follow, this time adding what sounded almost like a whine of frustration when he failed to respond. Then, as if making a difficult decision, the animal began to leave, moving slowly toward the forest with frequent backward glances that clearly communicated its disappointment. Silas watched it go, torn between caution and curiosity. Every rational thought told him to let the bear disappear into the wilderness and return to his normal routine. But something deeper, the same instinct that had driven him to pull Hickory from Elkbone Creek, urged him to trust this strange visitor and follow. Where it led Dot as the bear reached the edge of the clearing, Silas made his choice. "Wait," he called softly, reaching for his rifle and the pack he kept ready for longer expeditions into the mountains. "I'm coming." The bear stopped immediately and turned to face him, its entire demeanor shifting from frustrated resignation to what could only be described as relief. It waited patiently while Silas gathered his essential supplies: ammunition, rope, basic medical kit, enough food for a day in the wilderness. As he worked, Silas found himself talking to the animal, explaining his preparations in the same conversational tone he might have used with a human companion. "I don't know what you're trying to tell me, friend, but something about you suggests it's important. And if it has to do with Hickory, then I reckon I need to hear it." The bear's response was a soft sound that conveyed unmistakable approval. It waited until Silas was fully equipped, then began leading him into the forest along one of the game trails that crisscrossed the mountainside. The pace it set was comfortable for human travel, fast enough to cover ground efficiently, but not so fast as to exhaust a man carrying a pack dot as they moved deeper into the wilderness. Silas found himself observing his guide with growing fascination. The bear navigated the complex terrain with obvious familiarity, choosing routes that were well suited for human travel and pausing occasionally to ensure that Silas was keeping up. Its behavior suggested not just intelligence, but consideration qualities that challenged everything Silas thought he knew about the cognitive abilities of wild animals. The trail they followed led generally eastward, toward the high country, where the big bears traditionally spent their winter months. This was terrain Silas knew well, but not country he would have chosen to visit as winter approached. The higher elevations were already experiencing freezing temperatures at night, and the first significant snowfall could make travel dangerous for anyone caught unprepared. But the bear seemed confident of both its destination and its timeline, and Silas found himself trusting its judgment despite the obvious risks. Something important was driving this journey, something that had motivated a wild animal to seek out human assistance. Until he understood what that was, he would follow where his unusual guide led. As afternoon began its slide toward evening, Silas realized that they were heading toward country he hadn't visited in several years. Remote mountain meadows that lay hidden among the peaks like secret gardens. If Hickory and his mother had chosen that area for their reunion activities, they would have access to late-season berries, fresh water, and the kind of solitude that mother bears preferred when teaching their young the skills they would need for independent survival. The thought that he might see Hickory again sent a complex mix of emotions through Silas's heart. Joy at the prospect of reunion warred with fear about what condition he might find the young cub in. 3 weeks was a long time in the wilderness, especially for a bear that had spent crucial developmental time in human company. Had Hickory successfully readjusted to wildlife, or had his time in the cabin left him ill-equipped for the harsh realities of mountain survival? As these thoughts occupied his mind, Silas became aware that his guide was showing signs of increased urgency. The bear's pace had quickened, and it was checking back on his progress more frequently. They were approaching their destination, and whatever had motivated this unusual expedition was about to be revealed. The meadow lay before them like a scene from a half-remembered dream, golden in the late afternoon light that filtered through the surrounding peaks. Silas recognized the place Hidden Valley. The old-timers had called it, though he doubted many people remembered that name anymore. He'd hunted here occasionally in his younger years, drawn by the abundance of game that found shelter in this remote sanctuary. But he hadn't visited in over a decade, and seeing it now brought back memories of a time when his world had felt larger and more hopeful. The black bear had led him to a rocky ledge overlooking the meadow, positioning them with a clear view of the valley floor while keeping them concealed among the boulders and scattered pines. From this vantage point, Silas could see why his guide had chosen this particular spot. The entire meadow was visible below them, along with the network of game trails that provided access to the Hidden Valley. At first, the meadow appeared empty. Just another beautiful but uninhabited mountain landscape preparing for winter's arrival. But as Silas watched more carefully, movement caught his eye near the far end of the valley, where a small stream meandered through a grove of aspens whose bare branches created intricate patterns against the sky. 2 bears were moving through the meadow with the unhurried confidence of animals in familiar territory. Even at a distance, Silas could distinguish between them a massive grizzly sow whose golden brown coat caught the sunlight like burnished copper, and a much smaller companion whose dark fur and distinctive gait left no doubt about his identity. Hickory. The young cub was alive and apparently thriving. From Silas's position on the ledge, he could see that Hickory had grown noticeably in the weeks since their separation. His shoulders were broader, his movements more confident, and he carried himself with the developing dignity of a bear, learning to be truly wild. The sight filled Silas with a complex mixture of relief, pride, and bittersweet joy. Mother and cub were engaged in what appeared to be a foraging lesson, with the sow demonstrating the finer points of finding late-season food sources while Hickory observed and occasionally attempted to duplicate her techniques. It was exactly the kind of education that would prepare him for independent survival. And watching it unfold, Silas felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that his decision to let Hickory go had been the right one. But as he continued to observe the scene below, Silas began to notice details that troubled him. The sow's movements seemed labored, lacking the fluid grace he would have expected from a healthy adult grizzly. She paused frequently, as if gathering strength for the next phase of activity, and her attention seemed divided between teaching Hickory and monitoring her own condition. More concerning still was what appeared to be an injury to her left front paw. Even from a distance, Silas could see that she was favoring that leg, keeping weight off it whenever possible, and moving with the careful deliberation of an animal managing pain. For a bear approaching hibernation season, such an injury could be catastrophic, affecting her ability to prepare adequately for winter and potentially compromising her survival during the long months of dormancy. The black bear beside Silas seemed to be watching his reactions as much as the scene below. When Silas focused his attention on the sow's injury, his guide made a soft sound that conveyed unmistakable concern. This was why he'd been brought here, not just to see that Hickory was alive and well, but to witness a developing crisis that threatened both mother and cub. As if sensing the urgency of the situation, the black bear began moving carefully down the rocky slope toward the meadow floor. It paused frequently to ensure that Silas was following, leading him along a route that would bring them closer to Hickory and his mother, while keeping them concealed among the scattered boulders and pine groves that dotted the valley's perimeter. The descent required careful attention to both footing and noise discipline. The loose rocks that covered much of the slope could easily betray their presence, and a startled grizzly sow with an injured paw and a cub to protect would be an extremely dangerous adversary. But the black bear navigated the terrain with the expertise of long familiarity, choosing a path that minimized both risk and sound. Halfway down the slope, they paused behind a cluster of granite boulders that provided excellent concealment while offering a much closer view of the mother and cub. From this position, Silas could see the extent of the sow's injury with disturbing clarity. Her left front paw was severely swollen, and dark stains on the surrounding fur suggested ongoing bleeding from wounds that hadn't properly healed. The injury appeared to be the result of a trap, probably one of the old steel devices that had been abandoned in these mountains by trappers who'd given up their claims or simply forgotten their locations. Such traps were a persistent hazard for wildlife. Their spring-loaded jaws, capable of crushing bone and creating wounds that festered if not properly treated. Silas had encountered similar injuries before, and he knew the grim prognosis they represented. Without medical intervention, the infected wounds would continue to worsen, eventually leading to blood poisoning and death. For a wild animal, such treatment was rarely available, and the approaching winter would only accelerate the tragic conclusion. But what made this situation even more heartbreaking was its impact on Hickory. The young cub was clearly aware of his mother's distress, staying close to her side and exhibiting the anxious behavior of a juvenile animal, sensing that something was seriously wrong with his primary source of security and guidance. His attempts at independent foraging were half-hearted, frequently interrupted by the need to check on his mother's condition. As Silas watched this poignant drama unfold, he became aware that the black bear was studying him with obvious expectation. The intelligence in those dark eyes suggested an understanding that went beyond simple animal cognition. This creature had deliberately brought him here to witness a situation that required human intervention, and it was waiting to see what action he would take. The ethical implications of the situation were staggering. Intervening to help an injured wild animal violated every principle of wilderness management that Silas had learned over his decades in these mountains. Wild animals were supposed to live or die according to natural law, without human interference. That might upset the delicate balance of the ecosystem, but this wasn't a purely natural situation. The sow's injury had been caused by human technology, an abandoned trap that had no place in the wild ecosystem. And Hickory wasn't just any bear cub. He was an animal that Silas had rescued once before, whose brief time in human care had created a bond that transcended normal species boundaries. More pragmatically, Silas possessed the knowledge and tools necessary to treat the sow's injury. His decades of experience with trap wounds had taught him how to clean infected tissue, apply proper dressings, and administer the basic medical care that could mean the difference between recovery and death. The question wasn't whether he could help, but whether he should dot as these thoughts churned through his mind. A situation in the meadow below took a turn that made his decision unavoidable. The sow had been attempting to demonstrate a technique for extracting grubs from a fallen log when her injured paw gave way beneath her. She stumbled and fell heavily, letting out a low moan of pain that carried clearly across the valley. Hickory immediately rushed to his mother's side, his distress evident in every line of his small body. He nudged her gently with his nose, making soft whimpering sounds that conveyed both concern and confusion. The sow struggled to regain her feet, but the effort clearly exhausted her, and she remained lying on her side, breathing heavily while Hickory paced anxiously around her. The black bear beside Silas made a sound that was unmistakably a plea, then began moving toward the meadow floor with obvious urgency. It was clear that the situation had reached a crisis point, and immediate action was necessary if tragedy was to be avoided. Silas felt the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Every rational consideration argued against involvement, the danger to himself, the violation of wilderness principles, the unpredictable consequences of interfering with wild animal behavior. But watching Hickory's obvious distress as he tried to understand why his mother couldn't get up, Silas knew that rational considerations weren't going to govern his choice. He began checking his equipment, taking inventory of the medical supplies he carried in his pack. The basic first aid kit included antiseptic, bandages, and a few tools that might prove useful in treating wounds. It wasn't much, but combined with his experience and the natural healing power of the bear's own immune system, it might be enough to tip the balance toward recovery. The approach would have to be handled with extreme care. An injured mother bear with a cub to protect was among the most dangerous animals in North America, capable of inflicting fatal damage even in her weakened condition. But Silas had one advantage that might make the difference: Hickory's presence and their established relationship. If the young cub recognized him and reacted positively, it might help calm his mother enough to allow treatment. It was a long shot, fraught with risks that could easily prove fatal, but it represented the only hope for preventing a tragedy that would leave Hickory orphaned in the wilderness just as winter arrived. Taking a deep breath and offering a silent prayer to whatever powers governed the fate of foolish humans and injured bears, Silas began his careful descent toward the meadow floor. The black bear accompanied him, moving with the quiet confidence of an animal that had anticipated this moment and approved of his decision. As they drew closer to the fallen sow and her anxious cub, Silas found himself remembering the morning when he'd first opened his cabin door to let Hickory return to the wild. He'd thought that chapter of his life was finished, that his brief role in the young bear story had reached its natural conclusion. Now, it seemed, fate had other plans that would test both his courage and his understanding of what it truly meant to love. Something enough to risk everything for its welfare. The meadow stretched before him, golden in the fading light, and somewhere in its beauty lay either redemption or disaster for them all. Asterisk. The final approach across the meadow felt like the longest walk of Silas's life. Each step carried him closer to a confrontation that could end in disaster for everyone involved. Yet he found himself moving with a calm determination that surprised him. Perhaps it was the black bear's steady presence beside him, or maybe it was simply the clarity that came with accepting an inevitable course of action. But his usual careful deliberation had given way to something approaching peace. Hickory noticed them first. The young cub had been nosing anxiously at his mother when he caught their scent on the evening breeze. His head snapped up, and for a moment, Silas saw confusion flicker across the intelligent brown eyes as Hickory processed the impossible reality of his former caretaker's presence in this remote valley dot. Then recognition dawned, and Hickory's reaction was immediate and heartwarming. He bounded toward Silas with the unrestrained joy of a young animal reunited with a beloved friend, his earlier distress temporarily forgotten in the excitement of the moment. The cub's enthusiastic greeting, a series of huffs, grunts, and what could only be described as bare laughter carried clearly across the meadow and caused his mother to lift her massive head in alarm. The sow's response to seeing a human approaching her vulnerable position was predictably aggressive. Despite her injuries, she struggled to her feet, swaying slightly but managing to rear up on her hind legs in the classic threat display that had intimidated countless predators over the eons. Her roar echoed off the surrounding peaks, a sound that spoke of primal fury and maternal determination. But even as she demonstrated her willingness to fight for her cub, Silas could see the tremendous effort this display was costing her. Her injured paw couldn't support her weight properly, causing her to favor her right side heavily, and the strain of maintaining her intimidating posture was clearly exhausting her, rapidly diminishing reserves. Silas stopped at what he judged to be a safe distance close enough to communicate his peaceful intentions, but far enough away to avoid triggering a charge that might prove fatal for them both. He stood perfectly still, his hands visible and empty of weapons, while Hickory circled excitedly between him and his mother, clearly torn between loyalty to his family and affection for his human friend. "Easy, Mama," Silas said softly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd spent decades communicating with animals. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I can see you're in pain, and I think I can help." The sow's only response was another thunderous roar, but Silas noticed that she was beginning to waver on her hind legs. The display of aggression was taking more out of her than she could afford, and soon she would be forced to drop back to all fours, leaving her in a more vulnerable position. It was Hickory who broke the impasse. The young cub approached his mother and began making the complex vocalizations that bears use for family communication. To Silas's amazement, the exchange that followed seemed almost like a conversation, with Hickory apparently trying to convince his mother that the approaching human represented help rather than threat. The black bear, who had been watching this drama unfold from a respectful distance, chose this moment to make its own contribution to the negotiations. It approached the sow from the side, moving with the careful deliberation of an animal seeking to defuse rather than escalate the situation. When it reached a position near the injured grizzly, it sat down and began making its own series of soft vocalizations. The effect was remarkable. The sow's aggressive posture gradually relaxed as she listened to what the black bear was telling her. Her roars faded to worried grunts, and she slowly lowered herself back to all fours, though she kept her eyes fixed on Silas with watchful suspicion. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary display of interspecies communication that Silas had ever witnessed. The black bear seemed to be serving as a translator, conveying information between the grizzly sow and the human who wanted to help her. Its vocalizations alternated between the complex huffs and grunts directed at the mother bear and softer sounds aimed at Silas, as if it was explaining the situation to both parties. Gradually, understanding began to emerge from this unlikely three-way conversation. The black bear, through its patient mediation, was apparently convincing the sow that Silas posed no threat to her cub that he was. In fact, the same human who had rescued Hickory from drowning and cared for him until she could reclaim him. More importantly, It seemed to be communicating that Silas possessed the knowledge and tools necessary to treat her injuries. As this realization dawned on the sow, her entire demeanor began to change. The aggressive alertness gradually gave way to something approaching resignation, as if she was finally allowing herself to acknowledge the severity of her condition and her need for help. She lay back down on her side, her massive frame settling heavily into the meadow grass, and fixed Silas with eyes that held both wariness and desperate hope. Hickory, sensing that the immediate crisis had passed, bounded back to Silas and pressed his warm, furry body against the old trapper's legs in a gesture of pure affection. The young bear had grown considerably during their separation, but his essential nature remained unchanged. He was still the same curious, affectionate creature who had brightened Silas's lonely cabin with his presence. "Hello there, little fella," Silas murmured, allowing himself a moment to appreciate the reunion before turning his attention to the more serious business at hand. "Looks like your mama could use some help." Moving slowly and talking continuously in soothing tones, Silas began his approach to the injured sow. Every step was carefully calculated, designed to demonstrate his peaceful intentions while positioning him to assess and treat her wounds. The black bear maintained its position as mediator, ready to intervene if the delicate trust they'd established began to break down. When Silas reached a position where he could examine the injured paw, what he saw confirmed his worst fears. The steel trap had done devastating damage, crushing bone and creating deep lacerations that had become severely infected. The surrounding tissue was swollen and discolored, and the smell of putrefaction indicated that gangrene was beginning to set in. But despite the severity of the injury, Silas's experienced eye could see reasons for hope. The infection hadn't progressed beyond the point of treatment, and the sow's robust constitution was still fighting the toxic invasion. With proper cleaning, drainage, and basic wound care, recovery was possible, though it would require several treatment sessions and careful monitoring over the coming weeks. The challenge would be gaining the sow's cooperation for an extended medical relationship. What Silas was proposing went far beyond a simple one-time intervention. It would require the establishment of ongoing trust between a wild animal and a human, maintained over the critical period leading up to hibernation. As if reading his thoughts, the black bear moved closer and began what seemed like another consultation with the sow. This conversation was longer and more complex than the previous exchanges, with frequent pauses that suggested careful consideration of the options being discussed. Hickory contributed his own commentary, adding what sounded like enthusiastic endorsements of the proposed treatment plan. Finally, the discussion seemed to reach a conclusion. The sow fixed Silas with a long, measuring look, then deliberately relaxed her posture and extended her injured paw in what could only be interpreted as consent to treatment. Working with the careful precision of a man whose life depended on getting things exactly right, Silas began the delicate process of cleaning and treating the infected wounds. The sow endured the painful procedure with remarkable stoicism, occasionally tensing when the discomfort became severe, but never threatening to withdraw her cooperation. Hickory positioned himself where he could maintain contact with both his mother and Silas, serving as a living bridge between the two worlds they represented. His presence seemed to calm the sow when the treatment became particularly uncomfortable, and his obvious trust in Silas helped maintain the fragile alliance that made the medical intervention possible. The black bear watched the entire procedure with intense interest, occasionally offering what sounded like encouragement when the sow's endurance seemed to be flagging. Its role as facilitator and translator had been crucial to the success of this unlikely partnership, and Silas found himself marveling at the intelligence and empathy the animal had demonstrated as the sun began to set behind the western peaks. Casting long shadows across the meadow, Silas completed the initial treatment. The infected tissue had been cleaned and drained. Antibiotic powder had been applied to prevent further bacterial growth, and the wounds had been wrapped with bandages that would protect them while allowing continued drainage. "That's all I can do for now, Mama," Silas said softly as he packed up his medical supplies. "But you're going to need more treatment over the next few days if you want to get better." The sow's response was a soft huff that seemed to convey understanding and gratitude. She examined her newly bandaged paw with careful attention, testing its mobility and apparently finding the pain significantly reduced from what it had been before treatment. But as Silas prepared for the journey back to his cabin, he realized that this intervention had created as many problems as it had solved. The sow would need daily treatment for at least a week, possibly longer, and the approaching winter made such a commitment increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. The high country was already experiencing freezing temperatures at night, and the first major snowfall could arrive at any time. More troubling still was the question of what would happen after the sow recovered. The unusual alliance that had formed in this meadow represented a violation of the natural order that governed relations between humans and wild animals. Once the medical crisis passed, would these bears be able to return to their natural wariness of human contact, or had they been fundamentally changed by their experience of cooperation and trust? As these questions churned through his mind, Silas became aware that the black bear was once again watching him with obvious expectation. The intelligent creature seemed to understand that the evening's work was just the beginning of a larger commitment, and it was waiting to see how the human would respond to the challenges that lay ahead. Looking out across the darkening meadow, where two bears who should have been his natural enemies were now depending on him for their survival, Silas McGraw realized that his life had just taken another unexpected turn. The solitary existence he'd maintained for decades was about to become something entirely different and complex. Web of relationships and responsibilities that would test everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the delicate balance between helping and interfering. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear mountain sky, and somewhere in their ancient patterns lay the answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new opportunities to either build on the trust established tonight, or watch it crumble under the weight of winter's approaching trials. Asterisk. The discovery came on the third day of treatments, when Silas arrived at Hidden Valley to find the black bear waiting for him with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. Instead of the usual calm greeting, the animal was pacing restlessly near the edge of the meadow, occasionally looking toward the high country and making sounds that conveyed unmistakable distress. Hickory and his mother were positioned near their usual resting spot by the stream, but something was clearly wrong with the scene. The sow was alert and anxious, her head raised and her ears constantly swiveling as she monitored sounds that Silas couldn't detect. Her injured paw was healing well. The infection was under control, and the swelling had reduced significantly. But her behavior suggested that physical recovery was the least of her current concerns. "What's got everyone so stirred up?" Silas asked as he approached the black bear, who immediately began leading him toward a rocky outcropping that overlooked the valley's eastern approach. From this elevated position, Silas could see what had triggered the general alarm. 3 men on horseback were making their way along the distant ridgeline, following one of the old hunting trails that provided access to the high country. Even at a distance, something about their movement patterns and equipment suggested they weren't casual travelers or legitimate hunters. They moved with the deliberate purpose of men who had a specific destination in mind, and their frequent stops to examine the ground indicated they were following a trail. Through his field glasses, Silas could make out more disturbing details. The lead rider carried what appeared to be a military surplus rifle, and all 3 men wore the kind of gear favored by bounty hunters and hired guns. Their horses bore the lean, hard-traveled look of animals pushed to cover ground quickly, and the way they kept scanning the landscape spoke of men accustomed to dangerous work. But what chilled Silas's blood was the object strapped to the pack horse, a steel cage large enough to hold a bear cub. The implications hit him like a physical blow. These weren't hunters seeking meat for winter stores or trappers working legitimate claims. They were capture specialists, men hired to take live bears for whatever market paid the highest prices. And given their route and obvious tracking behavior, they were following the trail that led directly to Hidden Valley. The black bear made a sound that conveyed both urgency and intelligence. Then began what could only be described as a detailed briefing. Through a complex series of vocalizations and gestures, the animals seemed to be communicating information about the approaching men, their numbers, their equipment, and most importantly, their intentions. As this unprecedented consultation continued, Silas began to understand that the black bear possessed knowledge that went far beyond normal animal awareness. Its detailed understanding of human behavior, its ability to assess threats and communicate complex information, suggested capabilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about wildlife intelligence. More disturbing still was the growing realization that this bear wasn't just reporting on the men's presence. It was warning about a specific threat to Hickory and his mother. The way it kept looking toward the meadow where the grizzlies waited, then back toward the approaching riders, made it clear that these men represented a direct danger to the animal Silas had committed himself to protecting. "How do you know so much about these fellows?" Silas asked quietly, though he didn't expect an answer that would make conventional sense. What he got instead was something that redefined his understanding of the situation entirely. The black bear moved to a flat section of rock and began using its claws to scratch marks in the stone, not random scratches, but deliberate symbols that clearly represented something specific. As Silas watched in amazement, the bear created what could only be described as a crude map, showing the layout of the valley and the positions of various participants in the unfolding drama. But the most shocking revelation came when the bear scratched a final symbol near the edge of its stone map, a rough representation of a human figure, positioned in a way that suggested observation and intelligence gathering. The bear looked directly at Silas, then at this symbol, then back at Silas again, its meaning unmistakable. This wasn't just a bear. This was a scout, working for someone who had a significant interest in the activities of both the grizzlies and the approaching hunters. The pieces of an elaborate puzzle suddenly began falling into place in Silas's mind. The black bear's unusual behavior, its detailed knowledge of human activities, its sophisticated understanding of the complex relationships developing in Hidden Valley, all of this suggested the presence of a human intelligence directing its actions. But who would have such a deep interest in the fate of two wild bears and an aging trapper? And what were the real stakes of this game that Silas had unknowingly entered by choosing to help an injured sow? As if responding to his confusion, the black bear began leading him along the ridgeline toward a destination that lay hidden among the jumbled rocks and stunted pines of the high country. Their route was carefully chosen to avoid skylines and open areas where they might be spotted by the approaching riders, suggesting that concealment was a critical concern. After nearly an hour of careful travel, they reached what appeared to be an abandoned mining claim tucked into a narrow canyon that offered excellent concealment from casual observation. But as they approached the hidden location, Silas realized that the claim was anything but abandoned. A small cabin, well-maintained but skillfully camouflaged, nestled against the canyon wall where it would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Smoke from a carefully managed fire rose only a few feet before being dispersed by the mountain winds, and the entire installation showed the professional touch of someone who understood the importance of remaining undetected. The black bear led him directly to the cabin door, then sat back on its haunches and waited with obvious expectation. After a moment, the door opened, and Silas found himself face to face with a figure from his past that he'd never expected to see again. "Hello, Silas," said Dr. Margaret Chun, stepping into the afternoon sunlight with a smile that mixed warmth with unmistakable concern. "I was wondering when you'd finally make it up here." Margaret Chun had been the government wildlife biologist assigned to his district 15 years earlier, when the territorial government had launched its first comprehensive survey of bear populations in the northern mountains. She'd been young then, fresh from university and filled with enthusiasm for her work, but she'd also possessed a practical intelligence that had earned Silas's respect during their brief professional relationship. He'd heard rumors over the years that she'd left government service and gone into private research, but he'd never imagined that her work would bring her back to his mountains, much less that she would be conducting some kind of covert operation involving trained bears and hidden observation posts. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and wariness, "I take it this isn't a coincidence." "Not hardly," she replied, gesturing for him to enter the cabin. "We've been tracking those hunters for 3 days, ever since they crossed the territorial line. What you've stumbled into, Silas, is something much bigger than a simple medical emergency." The interior of the cabin was equipped with an impressive array of scientific equipment, radio communication gear, detailed topographical maps, and what appeared to be a comprehensive database of information about local wildlife populations. Charts on the walls showed bear movement patterns, territory boundaries, and population dynamics that would have taken years of careful observation to compile. "You're running some kind of research station," Silas observed, examining the sophisticated setup with growing understanding. "And that black bear, he's working for you." "Shadow has been my field partner for over 3 years, Margaret confirmed, settling into a chair beside a table covered with maps and photographs. "He's part of a program we've been developing to study bear intelligence and communication capabilities. What we've learned has revolutionized our understanding of what these animals are capable of." Shadow, so that was the black bear's name, had followed them into the cabin and now positioned himself where he could monitor both the conversation and the approaches to their hiding place. His alert posture and obvious understanding of the human discussion confirmed everything Margaret was telling him about enhanced animal intelligence. "But that still doesn't explain what this has to do with Hickory and his mother," Silas said, settling into the offered chair while keeping his attention focused on the woman, who was clearly orchestrating events he thought were random. Margaret's expression grew serious as she pulled out a folder containing photographs and documentation that made Silas's blood run cold. The pictures showed bears in captivity, not the clean, well-maintained enclosures of legitimate research facilities, but the cramped, filthy cages of illegal wildlife trafficking operations. "Those men following your trail aren't just poachers, Silas. They're working for a syndicate that supplies exotic animals to private collectors and underground fighting operations. Grizzly cubs are particularly valuable in that market, especially ones that have been partially socialized to human contact." The implications of what she was telling him settled over Silas like a suffocating blanket. Hickory's time in his cabin, the brief period of domestication that had saved the cub's life, had also made him a target for people who viewed wild animals as commodities to be bought and sold. They've been tracking him since someone reported seeing a tame bear cub in the company of a mountain hermit, Margaret continued. "Word of unusual animal behavior travels fast in certain circles, and there are people willing to pay enormous sums for bears that show signs of intelligence or trainability." "How long have you known about this?" Silas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We've been monitoring the situation since shortly after you first rescued Hickory from the creek," Margaret admitted. "Shadow was already in the area as part of our regular research activities. And when he reported the unusual interaction between a human and a bear cub, we realized we might be witnessing something unprecedented. The revelation that his private struggle with loneliness and unexpected companionship had been under scientific observation from the beginning left Silas feeling violated and manipulated. But his anger was tempered by the understanding that Margaret's intervention might be the only thing standing between Hickory and a fate worse than death. "So what happens now?" he asked, studying the maps that showed the hunters' probable routes and the limited options for protecting the bears they were seeking. "Now we find out whether a retired trapper, a wildlife biologist, and a very intelligent black bear can outsmart 3 professional animal smugglers before they capture a bear cub and destroy everything we've worked to build here." Margaret stood and moved to the window where she could observe the approaches to their hidden position. In the distance, barely visible against the darkening sky, the 3 riders were still following the trail that would eventually lead them to Hidden Valley, and the bears who had no idea that their peaceful recovery was about to be shattered by human greed. The game had changed completely. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had evolved into something far more complex, a struggle that would test not only Silas's commitment to protecting Hickory, but his willingness to trust others and work as part of a team for the first time in decades. Shadow made a soft sound from his position by the door, and Margaret immediately moved to check her equipment. "They're closer than we thought," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to move now if we're going to stay ahead of them." As Silas gathered his gear and prepared for whatever confrontation lay ahead, he realized that his solitary existence in the mountains had just ended forever. Whether he succeeded or failed in protecting Hickory, he would never again be just a lonely hermit living on the edges of civilization. The mountains were about to become a battlefield, and he was no longer fighting alone. The plan Margaret outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. They had perhaps 6 hours before the hunters reached Hidden Valley, and in that time, they needed to relocate both grizzly bears to a position where they could be protected while simultaneously setting up a confrontation that would neutralize the threat without escalating into deadly violence. "The key is understanding their motivation," Margaret explained as she spread detailed maps across the cabin table. "These men aren't killers by preference. They're businessmen whose product happens to be living animals. Dead bears have no market value, so they'll avoid lethal force unless they feel genuinely threatened." Silas studied the topographical features that surrounded Hidden Valley, his trapper's eye automatically identifying strategic positions and escape routes. The valley's natural geography offered both advantages and disadvantages. The narrow approaches that made it defensible also created potential bottlenecks that could trap defenders as easily as attackers. "What about the territorial authorities?" he asked. "Surely this kind of operation falls under their jurisdiction." Margaret's expression darkened. "The nearest territorial patrol is 3 days' ride from here, and we have reason to believe that someone in the government offices has been providing information to the smuggling syndicate. Until we know who we can trust, we're on our own." Shadow had been monitoring their discussion with obvious understanding, and now he moved to the maps and began indicating specific locations with careful touches of his claw. Margaret translated his recommendations with the ease of long partnership, revealing a level of interspecies communication that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. "He's suggesting we use the old mining camp on Bear Creek Ridge," she interpreted. "It's defensible, has multiple escape routes, and most importantly, it's far enough from civilization that we won't endanger any innocent bystanders." The abandoned mining camp Shadow had identified was a remnant from the territory's brief gold rush period 15 years earlier. Silas knew the location well, a collection of half-collapsed buildings and mining equipment perched on a narrow ledge that offered commanding views of the surrounding terrain. Getting the injured sow to that position would be challenging, but once there, they would have significant tactical advantages. How do we convince Hickory's mother to make that climb? Silas asked, voicing the practical concern that could doom the entire plan. She's still recovering from her injuries, and moving that distance over rough terrain could set back her healing by weeks. Margaret pulled out a small case containing what appeared to be veterinary supplies. We have mild sedatives that can reduce her pain and anxiety without compromising her natural abilities. Combined with Shadow's communication skills and Hickory's influence, we should be able to guide them to the new location. As they refined the details of their strategy, Silas found himself impressed by the thoroughness of Margaret's preparation. She'd clearly been planning for this contingency long before the hunters appeared, and her combination of scientific knowledge and practical experience had produced a plan that actually might work. But the emotional weight of what they were attempting settled on him like a physical burden. He was about to risk not only his own life, but the lives of animals who had come to trust him, in a confrontation with men who had no moral constraints beyond market considerations. The stakes couldn't be higher. Failure would mean Hickory's capture and probable death, while success might require actions that violated everything Silas believed about the value of human life. "There's something else you need to know," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that suggested this revelation would be the most difficult yet. "This isn't the first time this syndicate has operated in our territory. Over the past 2 years, we've documented the disappearance of at least 6 bear cubs and 3 adult animals from this region alone." She opened another folder containing photographs that made Silas's stomach clench with rage and sorrow. The images showed the aftermath of previous capture operations, tranquilizer darts scattered in clearings where families had been separated, damaged habitat where heavy equipment had been used to extract trapped animals, and most heartbreaking of all, tracks that told the story of mother bears searching desperately for cubs that would never be found. "Every one of those animals died in captivity," Margaret continued. "Bears aren't meant to live in cages, and the stress of confinement combined with inadequate care creates mortality rates approaching 100%. The people who buy these animals don't care about their welfare, their purchasing status. Symbols and entertainment, not living creatures with complex needs and emotions." The revelation that Hickory represented just the latest target in an ongoing pattern of exploitation transformed Silas's understanding of what they were fighting against. This wasn't an isolated incident that could be resolved through compromise or negotiation. It was part of a systematic assault on the wildlife populations he'd spent his life learning to understand and respect. "Then we stop them here," he said with quiet finality. "Whatever it takes." The afternoon passed in intensive preparation as they gathered equipment, refined their strategy, and established communication protocols that would allow coordination between human and animal participants in their desperate gambit. Shadow proved invaluable in these preparations, demonstrating not only his ability to understand complex instructions, but his capacity to suggest improvements based on his knowledge of local terrain and bear behavior. As evening approached, they began the delicate process of relocating Hickory and his mother to the mining camp. The injured sow required careful handling to prevent aggravating her wounds, but Margaret's sedatives proved effective in reducing her anxiety without compromising her mobility. Hickory, sensing the urgency that surrounded the adults, remained close to his mother while maintaining the alertness of a young animal aware that danger was approaching. The journey to Bear Creek Ridge took nearly 3 hours, following game trails and mining roads that had been carved into the mountainside during the territory's more prosperous days. Shadow ranged ahead to scout their route and ensure they weren't walking into an ambush, while Silas and Margaret flanked the 2 grizzlies in a protective formation that could respond to threats from multiple directions. The abandoned mining camp proved to be exactly what they needed. a defensible position with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. The old buildings provided shelter and concealment, while the elevated position offered commanding views of the approaches that any attackers would be forced to use. As they settled the bears into secure positions and made final preparations for the confrontation to come, Silas found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a lonely hermit whose only concerns were maintaining his isolated existence and preparing for another solitary winter. Now he was part of a team that included a government scientist, an intellectually enhanced bear, and a family of grizzlies whose survival depended on their collective courage and ingenuity. The transformation felt both natural and impossible, as if he'd been unconsciously preparing for this challenge his entire life, while simultaneously being amazed that such a situation could exist outside the realm of fantasy. But as he checked his rifle and took position in one of the abandoned mine buildings, Silas realized that the specifics of how he'd arrived at this point mattered less than what he chose to do now that he was here. Margaret's radio crackled with static as she monitored frequencies that might reveal the hunter's position and intentions. "They've made camp about 2 miles down the valley," she reported. "Shadow's intelligence suggests they plan to move at first light, which gives us about 6 hours to finalize our preparations." The waiting began, that peculiar combination of tension and tedium that preceded any significant confrontation. Silas had experienced it before during his younger years when conflicts with claim jumpers or hostile wildlife had required armed resolution, but never under circumstances that carried such complex moral and emotional dimensions as the mountain. Night settled around their defensive position, filled with the sounds of wind through abandoned structures and the distant calls of nocturnal wildlife. Silas found himself thinking about Mary Catherine and the promises he'd made at her deathbed. She'd asked him to keep living, to find reasons to smile again, and to remain open to the unexpected gifts that life occasionally offered to those patient enough to receive them. Hickory had been such a gift, an unexpected blessing that had reminded Silas what it felt like to care for another living creature. Now that gift was threatened by men who saw only commercial value in what Silas understood to be precious beyond any monetary consideration. The stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, the same constellations that had witnessed countless human struggles over the centuries. Somewhere among those ancient patterns lay the answers to questions about courage, sacrifice, and the price of standing up for principles that couldn't be compromised. Tomorrow would bring challenges that would test everything Silas thought he knew about himself and his capacity for decisive action under pressure. But tonight, surrounded by allies he could never have imagined and preparing to defend creatures he'd come to love, he felt more alive than he had in decades. The mountain wind carried scents of approaching winter and the promise of snow that would soon transform the high country into a landscape of pristine beauty and deadly challenge. Whatever happened in the confrontation to come, it would be decided before that snow fell, determining not only the fate of 2 bears and their human protectors, but the future of wildlife conservation in a territory where commercial interests were beginning to overwhelm environmental protection. Margaret's quiet voice broke the contemplative silence. "Silas, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that what you've done for Hickory and his mother represents the best of what humans can be. Win or lose, you've honored the trust they placed in you." As Silas settled into his vigil position, rifle ready and senses alert for any sign of approaching danger, he realized that Margaret's words had touched something deep in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For decades, he'd thought of himself as cursed, as someone whose love brought tragedy to those who accepted it. But perhaps the truth was more complex than that. Perhaps love always carried risks, and the choice wasn't between safety and danger, but between the courage to care and the emptiness of emotional isolation. Tomorrow would reveal which choice he'd truly made, and whether the bonds he'd formed were strong enough to withstand the test of genuine adversity. The mountains held their breath, and in that vast silence, the future waited to be written. Dawn came to Bear Creek Ridge with the deceptive peace of autumn mornings in high country. The sky painted in shades of rose and gold that would have seemed beautiful under any other circumstances. Silas had been awake for hours, his body attuned to the subtle changes in sound and scent that preceded sunrise in the mountains. From his position in the abandoned assay office, he could see the entire approach to the mining camp while remaining hidden behind walls that had once processed ore from these very slopes. Margaret's voice came through the small radio they'd positioned. Between them, barely louder than a whisper, movement on the south trail. 3 riders moving faster than expected. Silas adjusted his position slightly, bringing his rifle to bear on the narrow path that switchbacked up the mountainside toward their defensive position. Through his scope, he could see the hunters clearly, now hard-faced men whose equipment and bearing confirmed everything Margaret had told him about their professional capabilities. The lead rider was a lean, weathered man in his 40s whose eyes constantly scanned the terrain ahead with the wariness of someone accustomed to dangerous work. His rifle was a high-powered hunting weapon equipped with an expensive scope, and his movements suggested military or law enforcement training. Behind him rode 2 younger men who carried tranquilizer guns and portable caging equipment, their focus more on capturing than killing their intended prey. What made the sight particularly chilling was their obvious confidence. These men weren't approaching with the caution that the situation warranted. They were moving like professionals executing a routine operation, secure in their assumption that they faced no significant opposition. Shadow had positioned himself on a rocky outcropping that overlooked the main trail, his black coat blending perfectly with the dark stone as he monitored the hunters' progress. At Margaret's signal, he would begin the first phase of their defensive strategy, creating confusion and misdirection that might give them the advantage they desperately needed. In the shelter of a collapsed mine shaft, Hickory and his mother waited with the patient alertness of animals who understood that danger was approaching, but trusted their human allies to guide them through the crisis. The sow's injuries were healing well, but the stress of their situation was evident in her posture and the protective way she kept Hickory close to her side. The hunters reached the final approach to the mining camp just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, flooding the mountainside with brilliant light that created both opportunities and challenges for the defenders. Silas had positioned himself to take advantage of the illumination while keeping the rising sun at his back. But the same light that aided his shooting would also make concealment more difficult. "Range is 200 yards in closing," Margaret's voice reported through the radio. "Initiating contact in 30 seconds. The plan called for Margaret to reveal herself first, using her government credentials to attempt a peaceful resolution while the others remained hidden in reserve positions. It was a long shot. These men were unlikely to be intimidated by legal authority they could easily outrun, but it represented their best hope of avoiding bloodshed. Margaret stepped out from behind the ore processing building with her hands visible and her official identification clearly displayed. "Federal wildlife agents," she called out in a voice that carried clear authority despite the vast wilderness setting. "You men are trespassing on a protected research area." The hunters' response was immediate and telling. Instead of the surprise or concern that legitimate hunters might have shown, they reacted with the practiced coordination of men who had anticipated this possibility. The lead rider dismounted and took cover behind a boulder while his companions flanked out to create multiple angles of approach. "Research area my foot," the leader called back, his voice carrying a mix of amusement and contempt. "Lady, there ain't no federal jurisdiction within 50 miles of here, and we both know it. Whatever game you're playing, you best step aside before someone gets hurt. The failure of legal intimidation moved them immediately to the second phase of their defense. Shadow began his part of the operation, moving through the rocks and timber with the silent efficiency that had made him such an effective field operative. His goal wasn't to attack the hunters directly, but to create uncertainty about the nature and number of threats they were facing. The first indication that their situation was more complex than expected came when Shadow triggered a small rock slide above the hunter's position. The avalanche wasn't dangerous. Margaret had been careful to design diversions that would confuse rather than injure, but it served notice that unseen forces were active in the terrain around them. The hunters' reaction revealed both their professionalism and their limitations. They responded to the rock slide with tactical discipline, taking positions that provided mutual support while offering protection from additional slides. But their focus remained on human threats, and they failed to consider the possibility that they might be facing opposition from directions they couldn't anticipate. Silas watched this development through his rifle scope, his finger resting lightly on the trigger as he waited for the signal that would authorize deadly force. The morning air was still and clear, perfect conditions for accurate shooting, but he found himself hoping that the intimidation tactics would succeed without requiring him to cross that final line. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with neither side willing to make the first overtly aggressive move. Margaret maintained her position behind the ore building, using her radio to coordinate with Shadow, while keeping up a steady stream of official warnings that might eventually convince the hunters to withdraw. "You boys are facing serious federal charges here," she called out. "Wildlife trafficking, conspiracy, operation of illegal capture equipment on public lands. Walk away now, and maybe we can work something out." The lead hunter's response was a harsh laugh that echoed off the surrounding peaks. "Lady, the only thing we're facing is an interfering scientist and whatever local help she's managed to scrape up. This is territory business, not federal, and territory law says we got every right to trap nuisance animals that threaten human safety." "These bears pose no threat to anyone," Margaret replied, her voice carrying both authority and growing anger. "They're part of a protected research population, and what you're planning constitutes a federal crime regardless of local ordinances." "Well then, I guess we got ourselves a disagreement about jurisdiction," the hunter said, and Silas could see him signaling to his companions to begin moving toward flanking positions. "Tell you what, you produce some federal marshals with arrest warrants, and we'll be happy to discuss this matter in proper legal fashion. Until then, we got legitimate business to conduct." The breakdown of negotiations triggered the third phase of their defensive plan. Shadow emerged from concealment on the hunter's right flank, not to attack, but to demonstrate that they were facing opposition from an entirely unexpected direction. His appearance, a large black bear moving with obvious intelligence and purpose, created exactly the kind of confusion Margaret had hoped for. "What the hell?" one of the younger hunters exclaimed, raising his tranquilizer gun toward Shadow's position. "Hold fire." The leader snapped, recognizing that the situation had become far more complex than he'd anticipated. "That's not our target animal." But Shadow's appearance had accomplished its primary objective. It forced the hunters to divide their attention between the human threats they'd been expecting and the animal intelligence they hadn't known existed. In that moment of confusion, Silas made his move, rising from concealment with his rifle trained on the lead hunter. Silas stepped into the morning sunlight and let his presence be known. "Drop your weapons," he called out in a voice that carried the calm authority of a man who had faced life-and-death situations before. "You're outnumbered and outpositioned." The tableau that followed was charged with the potential for violence that could explode in any direction. 3 hunters with professional equipment and training faced a government scientist, an aging trapper, and a bear whose capabilities they couldn't begin to estimate. The abandoned mining camp that had once processed gold from these mountains was about to witness a confrontation that would determine the fate of animals who had no voice in human legal systems. The lead hunter's eyes darted between Silas's position and the rock formations where Shadow had disappeared, calculating odds and considering options. His companions waited for orders, their weapons ready, but their confidence clearly shaken by the unexpected complexity of their situation. "This doesn't have to end badly for anyone," Silas continued, his rifle steady and his aim centered on the hyena man who seemed to be making the decisions. "You ride out of here now, and we'll call this a misunderstanding. You try to take those bears, and we'll settle this the mountain way." The silence that followed carried the weight of choices that would echo through all their lives. Somewhere in the abandoned mine shafts behind him, Hickory waited with his recovering mother, trusting that the humans who had become their protectors would find a way to keep them safe. The morning sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, and, in its brilliant light, the future balanced on the edge of a knife. Asterisk. The lead hunter's decision came with the sudden violence of a mountain storm. Instead of accepting Silas's offer to withdraw, he chose escalation, dropping behind his boulder and bringing his rifle to bear in a motion that spoke of military training and combat experience. "Take them," he shouted to his companions, and a mining camp erupted into chaos. Silas's response was immediate and precise. His first shot shattered the rock inches from the hunter's head, sending fragments of stone flying and forcing the man to duck lower behind his inadequate cover. The message was clear. Silas could have killed him with that shot, but had chosen warning over execution. Margaret's voice crackled through the radio. "Shadow, execute Maneuver 3. What followed was unlike anything the hunters could have prepared for. Shadow emerged from multiple positions simultaneously, or at least, that's how it appeared to men suddenly facing an opponent whose intelligence and mobility they had gravely underestimated. The black bear moved through the rocky terrain with fluid grace, appearing briefly at one location before vanishing and reappearing somewhere entirely unexpected. The psychological effect was devastating. Bears weren't supposed to behave tactically, weren't supposed to coordinate with human defenders, and certainly weren't supposed to demonstrate the kind of strategic thinking that Shadow was displaying. The hunters found themselves facing an enemy that violated every assumption they'd made about the nature of their opposition. One of the younger hunters, panicking at the sight of a large predator moving with obvious hostile intent, fired his tranquilizer gun at Shadow's fleeting form. The dart went wide, striking a wooden support beam from the old mining operation and hanging there like an accusation of incompetence. Silas used the distraction to reposition himself, moving from the assay office to a position behind the ore cart tracks that would give him better angles on all three hunters. His decades of experience in these mountains served him well. He knew every rock, every shadow, every piece of cover that the abandoned mining camp offered. The lead hunter, recognizing that his tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, attempted to regain control through aggressive action. He broke from cover in a running crouch, trying to reach a position that would allow him to support his companions while maintaining some protection from Silas's rifle. The movement brought him into Silas's line of fire, and this time the old trapper didn't aim to warn. His shot took the hunter in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind a pile of tailings where he lay, cursing and trying to assess the damage to his gun arm. "Next one goes center mass," Silas called out, working the bolt of his rifle with practiced efficiency. "You boys need to rethink your career choices." But the wound to their leader seemed to galvanize rather than discourage the remaining hunters. They began coordinating their movements with professional precision, using hand signals and tactical discipline to create overlapping fields of fire that would trap Silas in a crossfire if he remained in his current position. Margaret recognized the danger and activated the final phase of their defensive plan. From her concealed position, She triggered a series of charges that Shadow had helped her place during the night, not explosives that would cause injury, but smoke generators that had been positioned to create concealment at critical points. Around the mining camp, thick, gray smoke began billowing from multiple locations, reducing visibility to just a few yards and transforming the tactical situation once again. In the sudden obscurity, Shadow's advantages became even more pronounced. His superior senses allowed him to navigate the smoke-filled terrain while the hunters struggled to maintain visual contact with their targets. The sound of movement in the smoke was accompanied by increasingly frantic shouts as the hunters tried to coordinate their actions without being able to see each other clearly. One of them fired blindly at a shadow that turned out to be a piece of mining equipment, while his companion called out positions and warnings that made little sense in the disorienting gray fog. Silas used the concealment to move closer to the hunters' positions, guided by sound and his intimate knowledge of the camp's layout. The smoke burned his throat and made his eyes water, but it also provided the cover he needed to end this confrontation before someone was killed. Through the radio, Margaret's voice provided coordination. Hunter 2 is moving toward the shaft entrance. Hunter 3 is pinned behind the separator building. What she didn't say, but what Silas understood from her tone, was that their defensive strategy was working. The hunters were being systematically isolated and demoralized, their professional confidence eroded by opposition they couldn't understand or counter effectively. The decisive moment came when Silas emerged from the smoke directly behind the second hunter, who was trying to use a tranquilizer gun to target shapes moving in the gray fog. Silas's voice, calm and absolutely certain, cut through the chaos like a blade. "Drop the weapon, now." The hunter spun around, trying to bring his tranquilizer gun to bear, but found himself looking down the barrel of Silas's rifle from a distance of less than 10 feet. The calculation was immediate and obvious. At that range, Silas couldn't miss, and the tranquilizer gun was useless against a target that close. The weapon hit the ground with a metallic clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the smoke-muffled environment. "Smart choice," Silas said, backing the man toward a position where Margaret could see him. "Your partner needs to make the same decision." But the third hunter, the youngest of the group, had apparently decided that retreat was his best option. Through the smoke came the sound of running footsteps and crashing brush as he abandoned the fight and headed downslope toward where they'd left their horses. Margaret's voice came through the radio. "Let him go. One witness to spread the word. Might discourage future expeditions." The smoke was beginning to clear as the wind carried it downslope, revealing the aftermath of a confrontation that had lasted less than 15 minutes, but had changed everything for everyone involved. The lead hunter sat slumped against a pile of tailings, clutching his wounded shoulder, while his companion stood with hands raised under Silas's watchful guard. Shadow emerged from the dissipating smoke like a creature from legend, his black coat unmarked by the battle and his intelligent eyes surveying the defeated hunters with what could only be described as satisfaction. He had proven himself in combat, demonstrating capabilities that would revolutionize understanding of animal intelligence if Margaret's research ever saw publication. "Well, gentlemen," Margaret said as she approached the captured hunters with professional restraint and obvious relief, "I believe we have some things to discuss about federal wildlife protection laws and the consequences of violating them." The wounded hunter looked up at her with pain-filled eyes that held grudging respect, along with anger. "You don't know what you're interfering with, lady. This operation goes a lot higher than 3 men trying to make a living in rough country." "Then you'd better start talking," Margaret replied, producing restraints and a first aid kit from her pack. "Because right now, you're looking at charges that could put you away for 20 years. Cooperation might improve those prospects considerably." As Margaret began treating the hunter's wound and securing both prisoners, Silas made his way back to the mine shaft where Hickory and his mother had waited through the battle. The young cub bounded toward him with obvious relief and joy, while the sow watched from her resting place with eyes that seemed to hold understanding of what had just transpired. "It's over, little fella," Silas said quietly, scratching behind Hickory's ears while keeping watch for any signs of additional threats. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, Silas knew that safety was a relative concept in a world where wildlife had monetary value to people, with no regard for the intrinsic worth of wild creatures. This battle had been won, but the war for the future of animals like Hickory would continue long after the immediate crisis passed. The morning sun, which had witnessed the confrontation with neutral mountain indifference, now shone down on a changed landscape, where impossible alliances had proven their worth and ordinary people had discovered reserves of courage they hadn't known they possessed. In the distance, the sound of a horse moving rapidly downslope marked the retreat of the hunter who had chosen flight over fight. He would carry news of this day back to whoever had hired him, and that news would undoubtedly shape future attempts to exploit the wildlife of these mountains. But for now, in this moment of hard-won victory, Silas allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in decades: the satisfaction of having stood for principles that mattered, surrounded by allies who had proven their worth in the crucible of genuine danger. The mountains had witnessed many battles over the years, but few had been fought for stakes as fundamental as the right of wild creatures to remain wild. Today, in an abandoned mining camp high above the territorial settlements, that battle had been won by the most unlikely coalition imaginable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today belonged to Hickory and his mother, to Shadow and Margaret, and to an aging trapper who had rediscovered what it meant to fight for something larger than himself. Asterisk. 3 months later, the first heavy snow of winter was beginning to dust the peaks around Silas's cabin when he heard the familiar sound of approaching visitors. But this time, instead of reaching for his rifle, he simply smiled and stepped onto his porch to welcome the guests he'd been expecting. Hickory emerged from the tree line first, now grown to nearly half his adult size and moving with the confident grace of a bear who had successfully navigated the challenges of his first autumn in the wild. Behind him came his mother, her injured paw fully healed and her coat thick with the winter fur that would sustain her through the months of hibernation. Ahead, Shadow appeared last, as he always did, moving through the forest with the silent expertise that had made him such an effective partner in both research and combat. The black bear had become a regular visitor to Silas's cabin, serving as liaison between the human and grizzly members of their unlikely extended family. "Well, look who's come calling," Silas said, settling into his porch chair and reaching for the wooden crate that now permanently held treats for his frequent visitors. "I was wondering when you folks would stop by for a winter goodbye." The reunion that followed was both joyous and bittersweet. Hickory had retained his affectionate nature despite his return to wild living, and he greeted Silas with the enthusiasm of a young animal who remembered kindness and safety. But there was also a new dignity in his bearing, a confidence that spoke of successful adaptation to the harsh realities of mountain life. His mother, who had once threatened to tear Silas apart for approaching her cub, now accepted his presence with calm trust. The shared dangers they had faced at the mining camp had forged a bond that transcended species boundaries, creating a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. As the bears settled around the cabin clearing, sharing the dried fish and berries that Silas provided, Margaret's voice came from the trail that led up from the valley floor. She appeared moments later, carrying the radio equipment and field notes that had become constant companions in her expanded research program. "I thought I might find everyone here," she said, settling onto the porch steps with obvious satisfaction. "Perfect timing for our winter planning session." The months since the confrontation at Bear Creek Ridge had brought changes that none of them could have anticipated. The captured hunters' cooperation had led to the exposure of a wildlife trafficking network that extended across 3 territories, resulting in arrests and convictions that had seriously disrupted illegal animal trade. Throughout the region, Margaret's research program had been officially expanded and funded, with Shadow's remarkable abilities serving as the foundation for groundbreaking studies in animal intelligence and human-wildlife cooperation. The black bear had become something of a celebrity in scientific circles, though Margaret was careful to protect his identity and location from public attention. More importantly, Hickory and his mother had not only survived their ordeal, but had thrived in the aftermath. The sow's recovery had been complete, and she had successfully prepared for hibernation while teaching her cub the skills he would need for independent survival. Their story had become a powerful symbol of wildlife resilience and the positive results that could come from thoughtful human intervention. But perhaps the most significant change had been in Silas himself. The lonely hermit who had once feared that his love brought tragedy to those who accepted it had discovered that isolation had been a choice rather than a curse. His cabin, once a refuge from human connection, had become the unofficial headquarters for a conservation effort that was transforming wildlife management practices across the territory. Any word from the territorial capital about the new protection legislation? Silas asked as Margaret organized her equipment and prepared for their regular planning discussion. Better than word, she replied with obvious satisfaction. The governor signed the Enhanced Wildlife Protection Act yesterday. Starting next spring, the kind of operation we stopped at the mining camp will be a territorial felony carrying mandatory prison sentences. The news was gratifying, but all of them understood that legal protection was only as strong as the enforcement. That backed it up. The real victory lay in the relationships they had built and the network of cooperation that had grown from their shared commitment to protecting the wild creatures of these mountains. As afternoon faded toward evening, the conversation turned to the practical matters of winter survival and spring reunions. Hickory and his mother would soon retreat to their chosen den site, where they would spend the coldest months in the deep sleep that sustained bears through the season when food was scarce and travel was dangerous. Shadow would continue his research partnership with Margaret, though his winter activities would be limited by weather and the reduced daylight hours. Their work had already produced scientific papers that were revolutionizing understanding of animal cognition, with implications that extended far beyond bear behavior. And Silas would return to his winter routine of solitude and contemplation, but with the knowledge that spring would bring visitors who had become as essential to his happiness as the changing seasons themselves. "You know," he said as the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, "when I pulled that little cub out of Elkbone Creek, I thought I was just saving one life. Turns out I was starting something a lot bigger than I ever imagined." Margaret nodded, her eyes reflecting the starlight as she considered the chain of events that had led from a simple rescue to a transformation of wildlife policy. Sometimes the most important changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness. What you did for Hickory created ripples that are still spreading. Hickory, as if understanding that he was the subject of their conversation, padded over to Silas's chair and rested his massive head against the old trapper's knee. The gesture was gentle and trusting, a reminder of the bond that had started everything and remained at the heart of all their subsequent adventures. "The territorial government wants to establish a formal wildlife sanctuary here," Margaret continued. "Your land would be protected in perpetuity, and you'd be appointed as the official guardian. Interested?" Silas considered the offer as he scratched behind Hickory's ears and watched the young bear's mother dozing peacefully in the starlight. The proposal would mean the end of his complete solitude, but it would also ensure that creatures like Hickory would have protection for generations to come. "I reckon that sounds like a fine way to spend whatever years I've got left," he said finally. Mary Catherine always said this place was too beautiful to keep to myself. As the evening progressed into night, the bears gradually prepared for their departure. Hibernation was still weeks away, but the shortening days and cooling temperatures were beginning to trigger the instincts that would soon draw them to their winter refuges. Hickory's goodbye was characteristically enthusiastic, a series of huffs and gentle nudges that conveyed both affection and the confidence of a young animal. Who knew he would see his human friend again when spring returned to the mountains? His mother's farewell was more reserved, but equally meaningful, a long look that seemed to acknowledge everything they had shared and survived together. Shadow lingered after the grizzlies had disappeared into the forest, engaging in what had become a regular debriefing session with Margaret about observations and plans for future research. Their partnership had evolved into something approaching friendship, though it retained the professional focus that made their work so valuable. Finally, as the mountain night settled into the deep quiet that characterized winter in the high country, Margaret packed her equipment and prepared for her own departure. "See you in 2 weeks for the supply run," she said, shouldering her pack and checking her radio one final time. "I'll be here," Silas replied, though they both knew that after decades of solitude, he was no longer truly alone in these mountains. That as the sounds of Margaret's departure faded into the distance, Silas remained on his porch, breathing the crisp air and listening to the night sounds that had provided the soundtrack to his mountain existence for so many years. But now those familiar sounds carried different meanings. They spoke not of isolation and loss, but of connections that transcended species and the ongoing story of a community that had grown from the simplest act of compassion. The stars that had witnessed Mary Catherine's death and his long years of grief were now observing a different chapter in his story, one characterized by purpose, partnership, and the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that his life had made a difference in the survival of creatures he had learned to love. Somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded his small cabin, Hickory was learning the final lessons he would need for independent survival, guided by a mother whose own survival had depended on the kindness of an aging trapper who had chosen to trust his heart over his fears. And in the hidden corners of the territory, other wildlife traffickers were reconsidering their career choices, aware that the mountains now held dangers they hadn't anticipated, dangers that came not from natural predators, but from an alliance of humans and animals committed to protecting the wild creatures who called these peaks home. The wind that carried these thoughts across the darkened landscape also brought the scent of approaching snow, the promise of a winter that would test the survival skills of every creature in the high country. But for the first time in decades, Silas McGraw faced that winter not with resignation, but with anticipation for the spring that would follow and the reunions it would bring. In his heart, the loneliness that had defined him for so long had been replaced by something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that love, when offered freely and without expectation of return, had the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities and the world they shared. The mountains held their breath in the winter stillness, and in that vast silence, the future waited to be written by those brave enough to believe that ordinary acts of kindness could create extraordinary change.